12 days after giving birth to triplets, Isolde Vale was ordered to the Great Hall to welcome her husband home from the Moon Temple. The freezing stone floor seeped through her thin slippers, chilling her to the bone. Yet she stood tall, knowing the entire Nightfall court was watching. Her postpartum stitches were still oozing. Lycan, the smallest, was wrapped in a woolen cloth against her chest, for it was only when he heard her heartbeat that his lungs would breathe steadily. Theo and Elias lay in 2 cradles behind her beneath the banner of a kingdom that Isolde had kept intact for 8 years by knowing exactly when to hold her tongue. Alpha King Cale Draven entered. He did not come alone. Aravale walked at his right, half a step behind, close enough for their scents to mingle. On Ara's neck was a fresh bite mark, the skin still pink. She wore a silver cloak that by Nightfall law only a Luna was permitted to wear, and as the Great Hall held its breath, she placed a hand on her stomach, leaving it there longer than necessary. Isolde heard the rushing of blood in her ears. She did not look at her sister. She looked at Cale, waiting for him to do the one thing that could still be salvaged. Cale would not meet her eyes. Elder Malrech stepped away from the Moon Council's seating, opened a leather scroll, and read in the voice of a man reciting a pre-written sentence. The Moon Goddess had chosen Ara Vale as the sacred consort queen of Nightfall. Isolde was to retain the title of Luna, to manage the palace, to appear before the public, to keep the throne legitimate, and to watch over the 3 heirs until the council took over. A second paper was placed before her. Guardianship of Theo, Elias, and Lycan was to transfer to the royal nursery, 2 hours a day under supervision. That was all that remained of her motherhood. "Did you know it wasn't her that night?" Isolde asked. Cale looked down at his pen. "What's done is done. Nightfall cannot withstand another scandal." In 8 years, that was the most honest answer he had ever given her. What Cale feared wasn't losing her. It was losing the throne. Isolde pushed the paper back and did not pick up the pen. Malrech gave a slight nod toward Cale, and Cale, through the mate bond he had sworn he would never use against her, gave the command. "Kneel and sign." Isolde's knees hit the stone floor before her will could protest. Her stitches tore. Warm blood seeped through her white dress, trailing a long streak across the stone, stopping at the foot of Lycan's cradle. Lycan began to cry. Cale inhaled to give the command a second time. He was too late. Elias, 12 days old, opened his eyes, and the child's irises flashed silver. Every light in the Great Hall extinguished at once. Outside on the pristine snow, a Lycan roar rose up. The Great Hall doors burst inward. Varric Morant stepped through the threshold, his iron fang guards fanning out behind him. He looked at the woman kneeling in blood, then at the king standing dry and untouched above her. "I have come to settle a debt with the White Cryptographer," Varric said. "But it seems Nightfall has just turned that debt into a declaration of war." No one in the hall answered him. 2 servants rushed to help Isolde, but she brushed them off and stood on her own, one hand gripping the side of Lycan's cradle for balance. Varric did not approach her. He signaled, and an iron fang guard placed 3 worn-edged maps on the stone table. Under the torchlight at the bottom corner of each appeared a mark of 3 interlocking arcs. "Years ago, 3,000 Iron Fang soldiers were cornered in Frost Pass," Varric said. "The night before the ambush, these were left in my tent. No names, no price, no conditions, only one sentence. Soldiers have families too, even when kings disagree." 3,000 men had walked out of Frost Pass out. The Iron Fang called the mapmaker the White Cryptographer and never found who it was. Varric walked the length of the hall, stopping 3 paces from Isolde, his eyes fixing on the silver brooch pinned to her shoulder. 3 interlocking arcs, perfect in every detail. "It was you," Varric said. Isolde had denied it for 8 years, even to her own husband. She looked up. "It was me." Cale turned his head so sharply his crown shifted. For 8 years he had believed his wife sat in the study embroidering and copying genealogies. That woman had quietly altered the outcome of a war he had used to build his reputation, and she hadn't said a word to him. "She aided the Lycan army," Malrech said. "Before the 9 crowns, that is treason. A Luna who feeds intelligence to the enemy has no right to keep her children nor her head." "Frost Pass was never an official war," Isolde replied. "There was no declaration, no seal of Nightfall, not a single line in the court records. Only orders to march troops through a pass that the Moon Council had tipped off to both sides. The Council needed 2 kingdoms to bleed so they could step in as arbiters. I just denied you your 3,000th corpse." Malrech did not respond. Varric placed a hand on the stone table. "Then I invoked the Obsidian Covenant. Two guards brought in a slab of obsidian as thick as a hand, black and light-absorbing. That ancient treaty predated even the Moon Council, any bearer of royal blood, or anyone protecting an heir if threatened within their own kingdom had the right to demand sanctuary claim. No king could sign away their rights. No council could vote against it. Isolde looked at the three cradles. Then she placed her blood-stained hand upon the stone. "I demand sanctuary," she said, "for myself and for Theo, Elias, and Lycan." The stone lit up from within a cold radiance, tracing the grooves like water finding a channel settling around her handprint. "Denied." Malrech stepped down a level. "The mate bond makes this woman the property of Alpha King Kael Draven. As long as the bond is uncut, no kingdom has the right to remove the Luna of Nightfall from these doors. You may bring your stone here, Lycan King, but you cannot override blood law." Varric stared at him for a long, heavy moment. "Then I shall grant her a status higher than his ownership." And then the Lycan King of the Iron Fang, the man whom border pacts taught their children never to look in the eye, knelt on the stone floor now, wet with Isolde's blood. He did not reach for her hand. He did not use his lineage to force a command into her bones. He said nothing to the hall. He only looked up and asked, "Isolde Vale, do you consent to become my lawful wife under the royal sanctuary law?" Kael sprang to his feet. "Surround him!" Spears were lowered. The Iron Fang guards drew their weapons. In the silence between the two walls of steel, Isolde did not look at the two men. She looked at Lycan, the infant breathing raggedly in his woolen cloth. "I have terms," she said. Varric remained on his knees. "Name them." "First, I have full custody of all three children. No council, no fortress, not even you. Second, you are not to use Lycan command or make claim on me, not even once. Third, every decision regarding me and my children must involve me in the room when it's made. Fourth, when this crisis is over, I have the right to leave this marriage without losing a single coin of my assets and without losing my protection." "I agree," Varric said. "All four." Then carved them into stone. An Iron Fang magistrate chiseled each condition into the face of the obsidian covenant in the center of the great hall, and with every condition written, the light within the stone grew denser. Isolde signed with her own blood, not ink. In the rose above the silver crown on Ara's head cracked from the rim to the peak, then split and fell onto her shoulders. She didn't reach down to pick it up. For the first time that morning she sought out her sister's gaze, but Isolde did not look back. Varric took off his cloak and draped it over Isolde's shoulders, covering the streak of blood on her dress. "From now on, anyone who touches my wife or my children is declaring war on the Iron Fang." Kael stepped forward. He walked between the two of them close enough that Varric had the right to strike him down before either army could intervene. Varric did not strike. He leaned down over the smallest cradle, lifted Lycan up with both hands, and spoke over Kael's head, his voice quiet. "You had 8 years to protect her. I only needed 8 minutes to know she needed to be taken out of this place." Isolde walked out of the hall beside him between two rows of steel that cleared the way, the Iron Fang cloak trailing over stone floors still stained with her blood. Kael stood alone beneath his own banner, and for the first time in 8 years he watched his wife leave without once looking back. The caravan left the Nightfall gates before dawn had fully broken. Isolde sat between 3 fur-lined baskets, counting the breath of each child like one counts steps in the dark. By the 4th mile, Elias's breathing changed. It grew shallow, then wheezed. The skin around the baby's lips turned a pale purple and his tiny fingers stopped gripping. Isolde opened the medical kit the royal healer had given her before they departed. The lung tonic bottle still had the right label, the right wax seal, the right Nightfall mark. She unstoppered it and held it to her face, and the scent that hit her was not the smell of licorice root simmered with honey. It was sweet with a metallic tang behind the sweetness. Belladonna mixed with silver salt, enough to crush the 2 young lungs of a 12-day-old infant, and subtle enough that any physician would write 3 words on a death certificate: postpartum complications. The entire future that Malrech had promised her in the Great Hall collapsed into a single simple truth. The council never intended to raise her 3 children. They only needed them alive until the day of the ceremony. After that, the 3 children were leftovers to be cleared away. Varric, how was at her carriage before she could call a second time? He looked at the tonic, took 1 sniff, and his face didn't change, only the veins in his neck stood out. "Lycan blood can neutralize silver salt," he said, "but it must be blood that hasn't passed through tempered steel. He drew the silver knife from the sheath at his hip and sliced a deep line across his palm. The silver bit into his flesh, keeping the wound from closing. Blood flowed in a steady stream into the spoon Isolde held. He didn't cry out. He only told her to hold the baby's head a little higher. By the fourth spoonful, the wheezing in Elias's chest eased, and the purple color drained from his lips. The first arrow arrived while Isolde was still wiping her child's mouth. It embedded itself into the carriage frame a hand's breadth from her shoulder, the black-painted wood marked with 3 notches at the tail, the craftwork of the Nightfall armory. The second volley didn't aim for people. They aimed for the last carriage, and when the arrowhead shattered, a fine chalk-like silver dust sprayed and whitened the entire compartment. The last carriage was Lycan's. Whoever chose the target knew which of the 3 children had the weakest lungs. "To the North Pass," Varric ordered. "The whole caravan. The road is wide. I can hold both flanks." "No." Isolde was already standing in the carriage, one hand holding Lycan, her eyes fixed on the pennant atop the lead vehicle. The fabric whipped to the right and didn't shift direction. "The wind is blowing from the ravine toward the pass. If you take us up there, we'll be running straight into the silver dust. Lycan will inhale it all within half a mile. The Iron Fang can hold the pass. The Iron Fang cannot hold the air." Varric turned to the captain of the guard and gave the order a second time with a tone no one in his army had ever thought to question. The caravan began to turn right. Isolde handed Lycan to the wet nurse, stepped over the carriage tongue, grabbed the reins from the driver, and pulled the lead carriage sharply into a rock ravine on the left. She shrieked a 3-note signal the call scouts used to signal one another in the fog, and the 3 carriages behind followed her because they had no other choice. Varric caught up to her at the bottom of the ravine, his face dark. "You just gave orders to my men." He hadn't finished the sentence when above them the ridge of the North Pass shook. It wasn't a natural avalanche. The muffled boom was audible twice before the mass of snow separated from the cliff and plummeted onto the very stretch of road Varric had chosen, so thick that the snow dust blew down to the ravine floor and extinguished 2 torches. No one said a word for a moment. If the caravan had listened to him, they would all be buried under that. Isolde knelt on the stone floor, brushed away a thin layer of ice, and traced her fingers along the cliff base until she found 3 carved arcs. She had carved them herself years ago, back when she drew maps for soldiers who didn't know her name. She pushed the stone, and an old tunnel exhaled a warm, damp breath. In the tunnel, once the 3 children were asleep, and the smell of silver dust only lingered on their clothes, Varric stood a distance from her and said something a Lycan King would never say. "I was wrong. If you had listened to me, I would have buried the 3 children I just swore to protect." Isolde didn't turn back right away. She retied the bandage on his palm tighter than was gentle. "You didn't use Lycan command on me. Good. But you still ordered 200 men to take me where I told you would kill my children. Not using the command doesn't mean you aren't controlling others." He looked down at his bandaged hand for a long time. His mother had died under a decree more merciful than that, and the one who gave the order had also called it protection. "Next time I will ask first," he said. "Next time will you ask after the troops are already deployed, or before you make the decision?" "Before I decide." She let him keep that, and she didn't thank him. At the mouth of the ravine behind them, a masked figure lay still under a tarp until the Iron Fang had fully withdrawn. On the tip of the shattered arrow he retrieved were 3 drops of blood stuck there from when the splintering wood tore through the wool cloth wrapping the smallest child. He wrapped the arrowhead in waxed silk and walked for 2 days toward the Moon Temple. Deep in the lowest level of the temple, in darkness, untouched by torchlight for ages, a vein on the sovereign seal grew hot and began to glow. Malrech placed his hand upon it and smiled, for the seal had just told him that the child bearing the silver moon mark was still alive. Iron Fang was nothing like Nightfall. There were no halls of mirrors, no welcoming music, only gray stone, a hearth as wide as a carriage, and guards who never took their eyes off a stranger. On her second night there, Isolde unwrapped the cloth to clean Lycan and saw it. A tiny circle on the inside of the boy's wrist, fine as a thread, silver in color. As she moved him closer to the candle, its outline pulsed slowly with the child's breathing. She had bathed all 3 children for 13 days straight and had never seen it before. The mark only appeared after the child had lost blood. 3 elder scholars from Iron Fang arrived before dawn, cross-referenced the children's birth times with the moon charts, and set their pens down. All three were born under the triple moon. Not one power divided by three, but three distinct parts of the same bloodline. One carries the authority of a ruler, the kind that makes others obey without knowing why. Elias can distinguish lies from magical glamours even when wrapped in human skin. And Lycan, the weakest of them, can awaken the sovereign seal. If the three bloodlines are united on the face of the seal, the oldest scholar said, it can do three things: depose a sitting king, recognize an heir, and transfer the entire power of a kingdom into a vessel of royal blood. Isolde rested her hand on the cradle. The vessel is a body. Correct, a body of royal lineage, but one that carries no official mate mark. A mate mark anchors a person to another line. The seal does not accept what has already been anchored. She understood before he even finished. Of the same bloodline as her, carrying no mate mark. In both kingdoms, there was only one such person, and that person was wearing silver robes in nightfall. Ara was not chosen to be queen. Ara was chosen to be the vessel. After the ritual, how long does the vessel live? Not long. When the power of a kingdom passes through a mortal body, that body burns. The one controlling the seal only needs the vessel's dying moment. In that instant, he speaks through its mouth, and the law obeys. Afterward, he can place anyone he wants on the throne. A puppet king. Malrech already had one. The man who had signed both decrees that morning without reading either one closely. Isolde sat for a long time after the three scholars had left. Then she brought out something she had kept hidden even more deeply than her identity as the White Cryptographer. 3 years ago, she had stood in the courtyard of the Moon Temple at midnight and counted the wooden crates being unloaded. Raw silver 11 crates, and 4 porcelain jars sealed with red wax, the wax that Nightfall used only for human blood. She had drawn a diagram of the tunnels beneath the temple, detailed enough for an army to pass through. Then she folded it up and gave it to no one. Back then, she told herself that if she made it public, the Moon Council would split in two, the border packs would choose sides, and Nightfall would have a civil war before winter. She had called the act of folding that paper keeping the peace. 3 years later, Malrech used that very silver to forge the shackles binding her children. Varric found her in the map room, the old diagram spread out on the table. I did not cause this betrayal, she said, not looking up. But I watched the darkness grow and still convinced myself that silence was peace. He stood beside her, read the entire page, then placed his finger on the eastern tunnel entrance she had drawn. Then this time we will not be silent. But the Iron Fang Council was not as united as their king. By the next afternoon, 4 elders stood up in the assembly hall and spoke plainly. The 3 children carried Nightfall royal blood and the ability to depose a king, yet they were staying inside the Lycan Palace itself. They demanded the children be separated from their mother for blood testing for 1 month. Varric refused publicly with a single sentence and offered no explanation. That night he summoned the commander of Black Hollow Fortress alone and ordered him to prepare the 2 northern cellars and an escort team of 40 to be ready in 3 days. He did not tell Isolde. He told himself it was just a contingency plan, not a decision yet. That same night Elias began to cry. It wasn't the kind of crying for food. The boy cried every time the door opened, and only when a certain servant entered, a woman newly assigned from the kitchen, her hands always folded in front of her. On the 3rd night, when she came to change the water in the pitcher, Isolde stepped out from behind a pillar and grabbed the woman's wrist. The skin was cold. Isolde pressed her fingers to find a pulse, moved them down, pressed again, and then placed her palm on the spot between the woman's neck and shoulder. There was no heartbeat at all. The servant turned her head toward her, slower than a living person, and the look in her eyes was not her own. In the middle of the room behind Isolde, Elias cried until his voice turned hoarse, while those dead hands still reached straight toward Lycan's cradle. Isolde did not call the guards. She dragged the corpse away from the cradle with all her strength, and when 2 Iron Fang soldiers broke through the door, the thing wearing the servant's clothes collapsed onto the stone floor, went limp, and never stood again. On the soles of her feet was a mark of red wax, the wax that Nightfall used only for human blood. 4 days' journey away in Nightfall, Alpha King Kale Draven began to investigate the night at the Moon Temple on his own, working at night without the council. In the temple's apothecary, behind rows of lead-sealed jars, he found 3 dried branches of a plant no healer was allowed to possess. Moonbane, the storekeeper, after being cornered in the back of the room, confessed the rest piece by piece. Moonbane didn't make people sleep. It compressed vision into 2 layers of blurred shadows and cut off the exact part of a wolf that distinguishes their mate from everyone else. It only lasted a few hours, and to fill those few hours, one more thing was needed: echo scent. A vial of post-birth blood still warm, taken from the Luna's bandages. Ara had taken it herself when she came to care for her sister. Because the 2 sisters shared the same bloodline, the scent rising from that blood was almost perfect. Not a copy. An echo. Kale confronted her in her private chamber, still holding the dried moonbane branch. Ara did not deny it. She sat up straight, hands on her knees, and gave him back the exact piece of the truth he didn't want to hear. "You were tricked until well past midnight," she said. "Yes, the potion did its work, but before dawn you called my name. Not your sister's name, my name. You said it twice." Kale didn't remember the whole night. He remembered that part. "Then you stayed," Ara said. "The sun came up, you saw my face clearly in the light, and you still stayed. By noon you personally signed the decree naming me sacred consort. No one can force a pen in an Alpha King's hand. You signed it because if Nightfall knew their king had slept with his sister-in-law in the temple, your throne wouldn't survive the season. I signed it to prevent a riot. You signed it to prevent a scandal." She looked down. "Then you signed a second paper. The 3 children into the royal nursery. You didn't even ask why the council wanted them under the temple roof." He opened his mouth to say that he didn't know what Malrech intended to do with his 3 children. That was the only thing in all of this that he said truthfully. "Do you want to put all the blame on the potion?" Ara asked. "The potion only fooled you for one night. The throne is what kept you there in the morning." Kale had no answer, and they both heard it clearly. 2 nights later, Ara descended into the western crypts of the Moon Temple, the section restricted to temple guards, because she needed to know when she was finally to be crowned. The 3rd door was unlocked. Inside, hanging on a wooden rack, was a sacrificial gown made of ash-colored raw silk tailored exactly to her measurements, even the specific alteration on the left shoulder that only her private seamstress knew about. On a stone table sat 3 small glass vials. One already contained 3 drops of dark blood, 2 remained empty, and beneath each vial was a slip of paper with a name: Theo Elias Lycan. Beside them lay an open file. Her name was on the first line. On the last line was a date 19 days away under the header "Expected date of vessel function termination." And on the highest pedestal beneath a shroud sat a hollow crown. No band, no padding, just an open frame, the kind you place on a supine corpse to keep it from sliding. For years she had believed Malrech's promise was one of recognition, that finally there was a hall calling her name instead of her sister's. It turned out they had never chosen her as a queen. They had simply pre-measured a corpse and were waiting for it to arrive. She left Nightfall that night, leaving her silver cloak behind. 4 days later, she knelt on the cold stone of the Iron Fang Great Hall, her hem still stained with mud, 2 Lycan guards pinning her shoulders, and looked up at her sister. Isolde did not step down from the dais. "Did you come here out of regret?" she asked, "or out of fear of death?" Ara could have lied. She saw Elias in the nurse's arms at the back of the room and knew that if she lied, the child would cry. "Out of fear of death," she replied. The entire hall waited for the Luna of Nightfall to do one of 2 things: embrace her sister or hand her over to the guards. Isolde did neither. She stood still long enough for Ara to understand that the distance between them was of her own making, and that no one would bridge it for her. Then she spoke. "Then live long enough to undo what you have done." The conditions were set that very night like a contract. To earn the protection of Iron Fang, Ara had to return to the Moon Temple and retrieve the ledger of rituals, the list of signed elders, and proof that Kale had been poisoned by Moonbane, because without those papers before the 9 crowns, her words were merely those of a traitor bargaining for her life. "I'll go," Ara said. She stood up, and before leaving the room, she returned the last thing she still held. "You think they only need 3 children. They don't." She looked her sister straight in the eyes. "Malrech needs you alive for the final ritual. If you die before then, his entire plan becomes meaningless. That is the only reason why that morning after you bled on the stone floor, he signaled Kale to stop." News of the ambushed convoy and the room beneath the Moon Temple spread throughout Iron Fang over 2 days. Border packs began sending riders to ask for orders. In the council chamber, they no longer used the word crisis. They used war. On the 3rd night, Varric ordered the 3 children moved to Black Hollow. I had calculated it carefully. The fortress lay behind 2 rings of cliffs. One entrance, 40 guards, no halls, no guests, and no new servants could pass the gates. He knew Isolde would object, and he told himself he didn't have time for a long argument while the enemy had already managed to get a corpse into his children's bedroom. So he did not ask her. Isolde woke near dawn because the room was too quiet. She bolted from the bed, and within 3 steps she saw 3 empty cradles, the blankets still indented by bodies still warm. The only thing in her mind was the room with 3 glass vials and 2 that were empty. She ran down the hall in her nightgown barefoot, holding a knife taken from the table. She cornered 2 guards at the foot of the stairs, pressed the blade to one's throat, and demanded to know which gate when. Both knew the answer, and both had been ordered not to speak. Varric arrived when the hallway was already full of people. "They are safe," he said. "They are on their way to Black Hollow, my 40 best men." Isolde slapped him. The sound of the slap rang to the end of the corridor in front of 2 guard units, 2 commanders, and an elder who had just arrived. No one touched her. No one dared look at their king. "The 3rd condition," she said. "You had it carved into the obsidian covenant in steel before the entire hall. Every decision regarding me and my children must have me in the room. Tonight you took my children from their beds while I slept 10 paces away. I moved them so they would live." Cale also used to say everything he did was to protect the kingdom. She lowered her hand. "Those who control others always label their own fears as protection." Varric stood there amidst his soldiers and heard his own father's voice echoing back. His father had never hit his mother. He only spoke in Lycan command, short, sharp sentences, always claiming it was because she wasn't strong enough to choose for herself. She died before she was 40 in a very safe room. He called for the cavalry to transmit the order right there in the hallway, canceling the relocation, and the 3 children were back in their old room by noon. That afternoon, before the entire Iron Fang Council, Varric Morant stood up and confessed that he had violated a clause carved into the Obsidian Covenant. He did not offer flowery apologies. He moved straight to the restitution. From that day forward, Isolde Vale held veto power over all military decisions concerning her and the children, and any order contradicting her regarding their movement was null and void, even his own. The council room erupted. "You have just placed a portion of the Lycan military in the hands of a Nightfall woman," an elder stated. "This throne has never been weakened so much by a foreign woman." Isolde stepped into the center of the room before Varric could reply. "I have not been a stranger to this kingdom as long as you think," she said. "Frost Pass, 3,000 men. I was the one who sent that map. I am the White Cryptographer." She continued, revealing details no one but the drafter could know: the 2 escape routes on the southern cliff, the dried stream used as a landmark, the 3-arc symbol at the bottom corner of every map sheet. The first to kneel was a veteran who had lost his right hand in that very gorge. Then dozens in the guard line followed, and then the soldiers standing outside the doors, the men who had walked out of Frost Pass alive, never knowing who had shown them the way. Without her, the veteran said, this kingdom would have had 3,000 graves. From that day on, Isolde was no longer protected by Iron Fang because she was Varric's wife. She stood in the council chamber because of what she herself had done. That night they sat together very late by the map table, and Varric said something he had not intended to say. "I am afraid of losing you," he said. "I know this was only a marriage of protection. You have the right to leave. I am still afraid." Isolde did not reach out, nor did she give him any kind words in return. "I don't know yet if I love you or if I'm just grateful you aren't like Cale," she said. "I won't lie to you about that just to secure 40 guards." Varric accepted that answer as if it were a contractual term and asked for nothing more. It was the 9th night since Ara had left Iron Fang. On the windowsill of the map room, the signal lamp that Isolde had placed facing east remained dark, and there had been no sign from the Moon Temple. Ayara entered the Moon Temple via a route only 2 people in the world knew: the old drainage tunnel in the east wall, a section her sister had mapped out 3 years prior before folding the paper away. She walked for 2 nights in the darkness and emerged right behind the archives room. The ledger of rituals sat in the second wooden box, recording everything with the precision of a meticulous bookkeeper: the Moonbane formula with the dosage for an adult alpha, the list of 14 elders who had signed for their shares, the order to replace the lung tonic in Luna's medicine box with belladonna mixed with silver salt, the order to ambush the convoy along with the number of arrows requisitioned from the Nightfall Armory, and a page older than all the rest noting the date Malrech sent word to both sides before the Battle of Frost Pass, along with the amount of silver he received afterward. The final page was what made her sink to the stone floor. The ritual didn't require kidnapping anyone. Only a drop of blood from a child bearing the silver moon mark touching the sovereign seal was needed, and the seal would automatically summon all three bloodlines to it, as long as the three children were within the radius of the conclave. 40 guards couldn't stop that. Neither could 2 stone walls. Malrech had obtained that drop of blood the day the convoy was ambushed. She tucked the ledger into her bodice and had only made it 3 corridors away before the lights ahead flickered on. Malrech didn't call the guards. He simply stood blocking the doorway holding a shallow cup and spoke to her in the tone of someone reminding a child that it was bedtime. The vessel must not leave the temple for too long. 4 men pinned her down. The cup was pressed to her lips. What was inside wasn't bitter. It was cold, and it stayed cold even as it settled in her chest. "Now the seal knows the way home," Malrech said. "Every time it wakes you will feel it. Don't go too far." Araran. She escaped the temple through that same old tunnel, and at the 4th turn she shone a light on her arm. Beneath her skin veins had turned black thin as ink strokes running from her elbow up to her shoulder. They faded when she rested. They darkened whenever somewhere deep underground the seal was stirred once more. If the ritual were completed, the thing inside her would burn away along with her. She returned to Ironfang on a rainy afternoon of hail, placed the ritual ledger on the table before her sister, and asked for nothing in return for her labor. Isolde read the entire ledger before speaking. She offered no forgiveness. She asked about every order, who signed it, the date, who delivered it, and Ara answered everything. Then Ara paid an extra price that no paper had demanded of her. 4 years ago I discovered they were taking blood from patients in my infirmary, she said. Not from the dead. From people still healing. I stood in the storage room and counted the vials. Then Malrech promised me the position of royal healer, and I wrote in the ledger that those vials were used for medicine. Isolde placed her hand on the page and held it there. 2 sisters, 2 storehouses, 2 counts, 2 silences. The sister silent to keep peace for a kingdom. The younger silent to have her name spoken before the sisters. The darkness had grown to consume them both. "We cannot change what we allowed to happen," Isolde said. "But we can decide what we will pay to put an end to it. I will go as a witness. Do you understand what Malrech can do with what is in your blood once you are standing in the middle of the 9 crowns? He will squeeze it from afar, and I will be dead before I finish my sentence," Ara replied. "I am still going." The night before the journey, she stood at the door of the children's room and did not enter because for the past 13 nights Elias had cried every time she approached the door. Isolde stood inside holding Elias and did not close the door. Ara took 2 more steps, then she extended a finger. The baby's hand opened, grasped her finger, and held on. Elias did not cry. In the whole room there was only the sound of hail tapping on the roof and the very faint, wheezing breath of Lycan, while the child who could distinguish a lie just lay still, holding the finger of the woman who had sold his sister and went back to sleep. The 9 Crowns conclave met at a neutral fortress located between the 3 borders where no kingdom was allowed to bring more than 50 soldiers within the walls. Isolde entered the hearing room in her capacity as Queen of Protection of Ironfang, her personal seal hanging from her belt, the 3 children in the adjoining chamber under the care of 2 nannies and 4 guards. Kale entered through the opposite door alone in his capacity as the Alpha King of Nightfall. Malrech sat on the Moon Council bench, hands in his sleeves, calm because he had calculated one thing correctly throughout 20 years of politics: a king will lie to keep his throne. Isolde did not speak at length. She placed the evidence on the table, one piece after another. The ritual ledger opened to the Moonbane formula page. The list of 14 elders with each man's thumbprint. The order to switch the medicine bottles in her kit signed 2 days before the convoy departed. The ambush order along with the arrow requisition logs from the Nightfall Armory, and the old page regarding Frost Pass. And finally, the testimony of a healer standing in the middle of the room with both arms wrapped tightly in cloth. "Aravale is a traitor to her own sister," Malrech said. "Do you intend to judge a member of the Moon Council based on the word of someone like that?" And as for the woman herself, she abandoned her husband, married the Lycan King on the very same morning, and now brings the Ironfang army here to seize Nightfall through her 3 children. The king sitting in the first chair of the 9 Crowns did not answer Malrech. He turned to Kale. "Nightfall will answer directly. Were you poisoned at the Moon Temple?" Kale stood straight. "Yes." "Did you recognize Aravale before dawn?" The whole room waited. Kale looked down at the stone tabletop for a long time, so long that Malrek shifted in his seat. Yes. The light in the outer rim of his crown dimmed for a moment as if a torch had been blown out. Did you sign the decree appointing her as sacred consort yourself? Yes. Did you sign the papers stripping the children's custody from their mother? Yes. Did you use the Alpha command to make your wife, who gave birth just 12 days ago, bleed on the hall floor? Kale turned his head. He didn't look at Nine Crowns. He looked at Isolde, and this time he didn't look away. I did. His crown dimmed, its light fading completely. Malrek didn't wait. He pulled his hand from his sleeve, slammed his palm onto the table, and in the center of the room, Ara buckled. The bandages on her arms turned black from the inside out. Dark veins crawled up her neck, reaching her jaw, and she clawed at her collar, gasping for air. At the same time, the stone floor grew hot, and the dust on the table began to dance. In the next chamber, Lycan started to cry, his wails piercing through 2 layers of wooden doors, and then in the span of 3 heartbeats, all 3 children vanished from the arms of those holding them. No doors opened. One nursemaid still had her hands cupped in the air where a baby had just been. Isolde had reached the door of the chamber before the crying stopped. Her hands gripped a blanket that was still warm. The sovereign seal only summons what belongs to it, Malrek said, finally standing up. The 3 bloodlines are in the ritual basement within the silver rings, unharmed. They will stay that way if the Luna of Nightfall takes back every paper she just placed on this table, declares before 9 Crowns that they are forgeries, and returns to Nightfall where she belongs. Otherwise, I take all 3 of their blood. The youngest first because it's the fastest. Kale didn't wait to hear the rest. I was already across the room and down the spiral staircase leading to the basement. Isolde was 10 paces behind him, and Varric was busy cutting off the council guards at the head of the hallway. The basement door was a solid block of stone with no handle, bearing a cast bronze seal of a wolf's head in the center. It could only be opened with the blood of the legitimate King of Nightfall, not royal blood, the blood of the one carrying the Alpha power. Malrek stood at the top of the stairs, making no move to follow. You know the price, he called down. That seal doesn't take just a few drops. It takes everything. Once you place your hand there, the Alpha power in you burns out forever. No commands, no strength, no throne. You'll just be a man who signed 4 pieces of paper. Kale looked at his hand. 8 years ago, this hand had placed the mate mark on Isolde's neck. 12 days after his children were born, this same hand had forced her to her knees on the stone floor. He pressed his palm against the bronze wolf's head. I chose the throne over my children once, he said. I won't do it again. The bronze bit into his skin. Light raced along the stone veins in a spiral, and the roar that tore from his throat was no longer the sound of an Alpha King. It was the sound of an animal being stripped of the very thing that made it whole. He collapsed against the side of the door, his fingers still stained with bronze. The ritual basement door swung inward. Behind the door wasn't a basement. It was a maze. Malrek had built dozens of ritual chambers beneath the neutral fortress, all identical down to every crack. The same stone table, the same 2 silver rings, the same 3 glass jars, and the same bundle of a child lying in the center of the table. Isolde opened the first room and saw Lycan on the stone table. She had barely walked halfway across the room when the crying in the basement shifted. Elias. The boy was crying somewhere below through the stone. And every time Isolde approached a chamber built of illusions, the sound would die out as if the child had stopped breathing for something that wasn't real. She backed out of the first room. The bundle on the table turned to dust before she even reached the door. From then on, she followed her child's cry like a beacon in the fog. If the room made him go silent, she left. If it made him scream, she went in. Above, Varric led the Iron Fang soldiers to block the Moon Council guards at 2 sets of stairs. Kale, stripped of every drop of Alpha power, crawled along the walls to each bloodlock seal and pressed his remaining hand against them, for the Nightfall blood in him remained even if the power did not. Ayara led the way for Isolde toward the end. She hadn't been able to stand for half an hour, but she kept moving one hand against the wall, the black veins now reaching her ears. At the final turn, she pushed a stone slab that no one would have found if they hadn't mapped it out. The real room had no illusions, and for that reason it was worse than all the ones before. Theo and Elias were locked in 2 silver circles on the stone floor, the 2 children lying on their backs in pools of cold light. On the stone table in the center was Lycan. A short, deep cut had been carved into the boy's left wrist, and blood was flowing along a groove in the stone down to the sovereign seal beneath it. The seal was glowing so brightly that every vein under the blood could be seen. Malrech stood on the other side of the table, his hands still tucked into his sleeves. "You only need to place your hand on the seal and claim the Nightfall throne," he said. "It's opening. It's searching for a ruler with royal blood, and you are the closest one in this room. Say it, and it will stop taking the child's blood immediately. You become the sovereign queen. Kale has already burned away all his power out there." Isolde didn't answer. She was watching the groove in the stone table, calculating how much blood her child had left. "I'll tell you the rest for fairness," Malrech continued. "If you take the throne, the Lycan King becomes an invader, for he is standing with an army inside a neutral fortress to seize a Nightfall Luna. Ironfang and Nightfall will be at war before spring. Your protective marriage is voided along with all 4 clauses carved on the obsidian. And the 3 children by ancient law become the property of the Nightfall throne, your property. No one will ever be able to take them from you again." That was what Isolde had wanted most since the morning she knelt on that stone floor. Her 3 children safe forever hers, only 1 sentence away. She placed her hand on the seal. "I do not ask you to serve me," she said. "I ask you to stop serving those who use the blood of children to rule." The seal didn't react. Lucan's blood kept flowing. The boy's toes had stopped twitching, and the familiar ragged wheezing in his chest grew thinner with every beat. Malrech began to laugh. Isolde drew a small knife from her belt, sliced across her own palm, placed her hand on the stone surface, right where her child's blood was pooling, and pressed down, forcing the 2 bloodlines to mix. She didn't claim the throne. She didn't claim anything. She simply offered her own blood to the seal that was taking it, and if it hungered for the blood of this lineage, it would have to take it from the mother first. The sovereign seal awakened. The light beneath the table surged upward into a pillar cold and harmless, and it bypassed Malrech completely. It sought out Isolde's hand, wrapping around her wrist like a locked shackle, then delivered its judgment in text that ran across the stone, readable to all 4 people in the room. She was not the master of the seal. She was the guardian of the crown. The silver chains in the 2 circles fell away on their own. Across both kingdoms, every pact the Moon Council had signed with the fake seal burned inside their boxes at the same time. And in the sky above the conclave, page after page of the ritual records appeared in cold light, large enough for every soldier standing in the courtyard to read their own elder's name. Malrech pulled a knife from his sleeve and lunged toward Theo's circle. Ara reached him a half-step ahead. She had no weapon. She simply threw her body between the blade and the child, and the knife sank beneath her ribs. As she collapsed, the substance Malrech had poured into her shattered. The black veins rushed backward from her neck toward the wound and dissolved into nothing. Kale broke the shackles around Elias with his powerless hands and an iron pry bar. Varric took down the last guard at the door and stopped at the threshold of the ritual circle. He didn't step inside. Placing Lycan blood into an active sovereign seal meant the 2 seals would declare war on each other, and that battle would not end within this room. He stood outside the line, his hands still covered in someone else's blood, and watched his wife walk toward the stone table alone. Isolde picked Lucan up herself. She pressed the boy's wrist against her bodice, keeping his head close to her chest, and walked out, using the exact number of steps she had taken to enter. The moment she crossed the silver line, the seal rendered its second judgment. Malrech no longer had the right to use magic. He hadn't even finished his incantation when the chains that once bound the 2 children crawled toward his ankles, dragged him face down onto the stone floor, and no one in the room stepped forward to help him. Theo was crying. Elias was crying. In Isolde's arms, Lucan took a long, rattling breath, and then breathed again. Ara was still alive, her sleeves black with blood, her eyes still open. Varric approached Isolde. He held out his hands but didn't touch the baby, and he waited. "May I help you?" Isolde looked down at her own bloodied hands, then at his, and placed Lucan into them. The Moon Council trial lasted 11 days, and not a single elder was allowed to sit. Malrech and 14 others on the list were stripped of their titles, their magic, and were permanently imprisoned in the Hollow Moon, the very place they once used to lock away those who knew too much. The verdict included 1 additional clause that Isolde wrote herself, and the 9 Crowns approved. The entire record of those killed by the Moon Council over the last 40 years had to be read publicly, naming every individual in the very pack where they were born. Ara lived. She lost most of her healing abilities, along with the thing that had burned in her blood. She was stripped of her inheritance, banned from practicing independently, and because she had brought the evidence to the conclave and shielded Theo from the blade, she was not executed. She was sent to a medical station on the border, working under supervision, forbidden from touching any poisons, and not allowed to treat any patient on her own. Isolde visited her exactly once before she departed. "I have begun to repay my debt," she said. "Do not mistake that for the debt being finished." Chaol abdicated on the 12th day, not in the Great Hall, but on the steps before the castle gates, so that everyone who had once heard his orders could hear this. A regency council was established consisting of the Beta of Nightfall, a warrior representative, a healer, an Omega, a commoner, and 2 representatives from the border packs. After 1 year, Nightfall would open a convention to choose a king according to the ancient laws the Moon Council had hidden away for 4 generations. He signed the final document with his left hand, as his right was not yet healed. Full guardianship of Theo Elias and Lycan belonged to Isolde Vale. He was only allowed to see the children when she agreed, and there was always a third person in the room. The severance ritual was performed in the courtyard with no audience. The 2 of them placed their hands on an ancient dulled blade, each on one side. "I used to think the mate bond meant you would never leave me," Chaol said. "And because you believed I couldn't leave you, stop choosing me," Isolde replied. The blade heated up between their hands. The 8-year-old bond didn't break with a sound. It simply compressed everything. It had ever carried into a single point behind the breastbone, flared once, then vanished, leaving behind a very distinct void. Chaol collapsed to his knees, gasping like someone who had just had both his heir and his name taken away. Isolde remained standing. She stayed for a moment to ensure she could stand, then walked to the gate where her 3 children were waiting in the carriage. Throughout the trip back, she didn't say a single word to Varric about love. Upon returning to Iron Fang, the first thing he did was place a pre-signed document before her, an annulment, sealed by the Lycan King, effective any day she wished, with no property ties and no guardianship obligations. Isolde did not tear it up. She folded it and placed it in her own private box. Over the next 6 months, the 2 of them wrote the 2 Crowns Charter, and they argued almost every week. Varric wanted to use the army to quickly crush the pacts that still worshipped the Moon Council. Isolde wanted to amend the laws because an army could only crush people, not the clauses that allowed a council to take the blood of children. Varric wanted to build 2 more guard rings around where she lived after the second assassination attempt. Isolde refused to live behind walls and visited 3 border stations on her own that month. There were nights she reread every order he signed during the day, not because he was lying, but because Chaol had taught her that a person could sign a paper to kill their own child and still claim they were protecting the kingdom. Varric learned not to take that suspicion as an insult. By the 5th month, Isolde had her own seal, her own treasury, 2,000 soldiers under her command, and a seat in the council room that no one could vote to take away. She could absolutely leave. That was what made staying a different kind of answer. On the 6-month anniversary, Varric led her to the backyard. There a carriage was ready with 4 horses, enough supplies for a month's journey, 3 wool-lined baskets fastened securely inside, and 20 escorts standing by awaiting her orders, not his. "This is the exit I promised," he said. You can take the children anywhere. No one will stop you." Isolde walked to the carriage, placed her hand on the wooden frame, then took the paper she had kept for 6 months from inside her coat. She tore the annulment right in front of him into 2, then into 4. "The first time I married you, it was because I needed to survive," she said. "Today I stay because I have lived freely enough to know whom I want by my side." Their second wedding was nothing like the first. There was no blood on the stone floor, no obsidian tablet, no royal protection law, no 2 rows of steel waiting for orders on either side. Varric did not place a mate mark on her neck, nor did he once reach for that spot. They exchanged 2 identical rings from the same mold of the same weight, so that anyone looking at them would not know whose ring belonged to whom. Isolde became the sovereign queen, co-ruling Iron Fang. She kept her own seal veto power, the army under her command, the right to protect Omegas and children in both kingdoms, and a clause she herself demanded be carved into the charter, the right to abdicate without losing her rights as a mother. Theo Elias and Lycan were recognized as princes of Iron Fang, but would not automatically inherit the throne. The successor would be chosen based on merit and the kingdom's consensus, and no child would ever again be born to serve as a key to a throne. One late autumn afternoon, Isolde stood on the east balcony. Varric stood beside her, not in front of her. Down in the courtyard, Theo was chasing Elias around the fountain and neither could run steadily yet. Lucan slept in Varric's arms, his left wrist exposing a thin silver band that had faded significantly. A messenger came to the balcony, knelt on one knee and held up a letter sealed with the nightfall wax. Cale was asking to see the children. Isolde took it. She didn't tear it. She couldn't speak immediately either. Then she placed the letter down on the stone railing right beneath her hand. The right to correct one's mistakes does not mean the right to reclaim what one has destroyed, she said. Below, the courtyard was full of Iron Fang people waiting for their queen to step out. Isolde adjusted her cloak and walked out before them as a queen who belonged to no man. She belonged to herself. And because she was completely free, she could finally choose to love the man who stood as her equal. Isolde did not leave one king to belong to another. She became free enough to choose the man who would stand beside her, never above her. If you would like to stay for the next story, I will continue it here.